Ron Craig here, discussing with you the way it really is, according to God's written word. Bible truth you may or may not already know. Bible truth you need to know. Bible truth you can know. And Bible truth you can check out with your own Bible. Today we live in what is called the information age, and the volume of that information is overwhelming. And besides that, much of that information is contradictory. Thus, not everything we see or hear can be trusted. So how can we know for sure what to believe and what not to believe? Well, the Bible helps us unravel those uncertainties. Let me share with you a Bible truth that will help you make right decisions about what you can safely believe and what you ought not to believe. God's Word is filled with unchanging principles that help us recognize good information and cull the bad. This first principle is found early in Genesis, first book of the Bible. That unchanging Bible principle is, believing that something is so does not make it so. And the opposite side of that coin, so to speak, believing that something is not so does not make it not so. If it is so, then it is so, and if it is not so, then it is not so. And the Bible has a lot to say about both sides of that coin. Now, the first example of that unchanging Bible principle. God warned Adam and Eve that in the day they ate fruit from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would surely die. Literally, dying, you will die. They would die spiritually on that very day, and that inner death would catch up with their physical bodies later on. Then the devil came along, and that is one more Bible subject we will study later on. The devil proclaiming the very opposite. Remember about all of that conflicting information bombarding people today. Satan obviously convinced Eve that her eating fruit from that forbidden tree would not produce death, but rather, if she ate that fruit, she would actually be better off. Therefore, Eve was presented with two thoroughly opposing claims by two obviously opposing personalities. Eve decided to believe that what the devil had told her about that forbidden tree through the garden snake was so. And his words being the very opposite of God's warning, she obviously decided to believe that God's words were not so. Adam and Eve discovered the hard way that the devil's words were not so, and that God's words were so. Basing their decision upon false information, they opened the door to the devil's lies, allowing him to fill the world with false information. But truth is available too. Now that was the first Old Covenant example of that unchanging scriptural principle. What principle? Or believing that something is so does not make it so, and believing that something is not so does not make it not so. If it is so, then it is so, and if it is not so, then it is not so. And God's Word helps us learn to discern what is so and what is not so. Even regarding that information bombarding people today through every kind of medium, Bible principles apply. Now let us look at a New Testament case which exemplifies that same Bible principle that we discovered in the book of Genesis. Saul of Tarsus, who became known as Paul the Apostle, exemplified that same Bible truth in his experience. That man had become convinced by his religious training that what he believed to be the truth was the truth, and what those Jews had become Christians were boldly teaching was not the truth, but rather a lie and had to be silenced. Saul of Tarsus was so smug in his own personal convictions that he stooped to jailing and murdering any who opposed his religious beliefs. By the way, people living in this modern world commit the same atrocities today. In fact, it has been happening ever since that generation of Adam and Eve when they fell. And of course, ever since the days of Saul of Tarsus. As it turned out in Saul's case, after reviling that supposedly mystical Jesus, whom Christians were believing in and preaching, Saul of Tarsus himself came face to face with the resurrected Christ. Saul was confronted by the living one whom he had thought was only a myth, and learned that what he had believed to be not so was so after all, and that those things he had believed to be so were not so after all. This case of Saul of Tarsus provides a perfect example of the Bible truth I want to communicate, that it is wise to measure the things we believe to be so and not so by the only dependable standard, the Holy Bible. In doing so, we all might just be surprised at what we learn about our convictions and the things we need to change about what we believe to be so and not so. Could it possibly be that most today believe things about people and things, beliefs that have no basis in reality, but instead are based on false information? And could you and I be in that number? We each must answer that question for ourselves. And we start by being honest with ourselves and the Bible. This is lesson 1 of The Way It Really Is.